I am Jada, 33 years old. My parents invited me to an ultra-exclusive steakhouse in Chicago to make amends after 3 years of zero contact. When I arrived, I found not just my parents, but 16 extended family members already elbow-deep in Wagyu beef Maine lobster and 3 bottles of Louis XIII cognac. The bill came to $10,450. My dad slid the leather folder to me and smiled, saying I should pay since I was the one who owed them. I did not argue. I called the manager over and whispered exactly 2 sentences. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives trying to use you. The heavy leather folder landed on the pristine white tablecloth with a soft thud. $1,450. I stared at the bold printed numbers at the bottom of the receipt. For the past 2 hours, I had sat in silence, while my estranged family treated the menu like a lottery winning. I watched my aunts order seafood towers they barely touched. I watched my uncles demand top-shelf liquor without even looking at the prices. Nobody had asked about my life. Nobody had apologized for the years of emotional abuse that drove me to cut ties in the first place. They just ate, drank, and laughed, completely ignoring me until the moment the waiter presented the damage. Around the massive private dining table, the chaotic chatter suddenly died down. My father Marcus leaned back in his plush velvet chair, looking utterly satisfied. He picked his teeth with a gold-plated toothpick, a cheap prop he bought online just to look wealthy. He told me that since I live right here in the city now and work in some corporate office making big city money, I should cover this reunion dinner. He said I should consider it paying them back for everything they did to raise me. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of asking your estranged daughter to fund a banquet for 16 people, my younger sister Tasha chimed in. She stroked the strap of her obviously fake Chanel bag, leaning across the table with a nasty smirk. She sneered and told me to come on, pointing out that I do not have a husband or any kids to spend my money on. She said I could afford to treat my family for once, adding that it was the least I could do since I missed so many holidays being bitter and isolating myself. She leaned into her husband Brad, making sure everyone noticed her flashy engagement ring. Brad was a 32-year-old finance bro who worked as a portfolio manager. I was the white savior my parents absolutely worshipped. In their eyes, his job in the financial district gave them proximity to real wealth and status. They constantly compared my independent struggles to his supposed corporate brilliance. Brad adjusted his French cuffs, making a deliberate show of checking his Rolex. He asked with a patronizing chuckle if I needed him to front half the bill. He said he knew my credit score probably could not handle a hit like this, and told me to let the adults take care of the big boy numbers if I was struggling. He added that we would not want my card getting declined in front of the whole family. He looked around the table, soaking up the admiring glances and appreciative laughter from my aunts and uncles. They practically beamed at his arrogant generosity. I looked at Brad, then at Tasha, and finally at my father. For a brief second, the old Jada wanted to scream. The 19-year-old girl they had kicked out with nothing but a trash bag full of clothes wanted to yell at the unfairness of it all. I wanted to remind them how they had constantly belittled my ambitions while funding Tasha's endless shopping sprees, but I was not 19 anymore. I had spent the last 14 years building an empire they knew absolutely nothing about. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I did not need to defend my bank account to people who were drowning in their own insecurities. I simply caught the eye of the restaurant manager, who had been hovering near the entrance of our private room. He walked over immediately, his posture perfectly respectful. He knew exactly who I was. I was not just a customer. I was the silent majority partner of the venture capital firm that owned this entire restaurant group. I literally signed his paychecks. I leaned in and whispered 2 sentences to him. I told him to split the check 15 ways excluding me, and not to let anyone leave until every single card clears. The manager did not even blink. He nodded briskly and said, "Right away, ma'am." He picked up the leather folder and walked back toward the serving station. I stood up smoothly and grabbed my tailored wool coat from the back of my chair. My mother Vivian demanded to know where I was going, her voice sharp with sudden panic. She pointed out that I had not put my card down yet, and the waiter took the bill away. I buttoned my coat and looked down at the people who had spent my entire life making me feel small. I told them I came here tonight because they said they wanted to apologize. I kept my tone completely flat and devoid of any emotion. I reminded them they said they wanted to heal our family, but it turned out they just needed a convenient ATM to fund their fake rich lifestyle. I apologized coldly, stating that my money does not sponsor parasites. My father slammed his fist on the table. He ordered me to sit back down right now, shouting that I do not disrespect my family like this when they came all the way out here for me. I ignored him, turning on my heel and walking toward the exit. Behind me, the heavy wooden doors of the private dining room swung open. A team of 4 waiters marched in, their faces completely professional. Instead of one large bill, they began dropping 15 separate itemized receipts onto the table, placing one directly in front of each adult family member. I paused just outside the doorway, listening as the arrogant smirks dissolved into absolute chaos. I could hear my aunts gasping at the sight of the $700 individual totals. I heard my father shouting at the waiters that there had been a mistake. I heard Brad aggressively demanding they bring the original bill back because he was a VIP. But the waiters stood their ground, holding out the payment terminals. The trap had been sprung, and they were all caught right in the middle of it. I kept my pace measured and my posture perfectly straight as I glided across the hand-woven carpets of the main dining room. I did not run, and I did not storm off, because running is for people who are afraid of the consequences. I was the consequence. Behind me, the muffled sounds of outrage spilling from the private dining room were like a symphony to my ears. My father was shouting about disrespect, but his voice was quickly drowned out by Brad. Good old Brad was always eager to play the wealthy white savior for my black family, a role my parents practically begged him to fill. I could picture him perfectly puffing out his chest, adjusting his designer tie and stepping up to rescue his helpless in-laws from the mess created by their rebellious, ungrateful daughter. I heard his voice boom through the cracked double doors, dripping with that unbearable finance bro arrogance. He told the waiter to relax, loudly announcing that he would handle the check because his platinum card has no limit. He even threw in a loud, patronizing laugh, telling my father not to worry about Jada's little tantrum, since Vanguard pays him well enough to cover a few lobsters. He wanted everyone in the restaurant to know he was the big man in the room. What Brad did not know, and what my family could never comprehend, was the reality of the ground they were standing on. I did not just work a little office job in the city. 2 years ago, when this historic steakhouse and its 4 sister properties were facing bankruptcy, my venture capital firm swooped in. We bought the entire restaurant group for pennies on the dollar, restructured the management, and turned it into the most exclusive dining experience in Chicago. I am the silent majority partner. The general manager, a brilliant man named Antoine, who is currently handling my family reports directly to me. I saved his job when the old owners wanted to liquidate. Antoine knows my favorite table, he knows my favorite vintage of wine, and most importantly, he knows exactly how to execute my instructions without batting an eye. When I whispered to him to split the check 15 ways and run every single card, I knew exactly what I was doing. I had seen the subtle signs of financial distress dripping from my family all night. Tasha's Chanel bag was a high-quality counterfeit. My father's suit jacket was a season past its prime and pulling at the seams. Brad kept talking about his investments, but he drank the free water while letting everyone else order the $2,000 wine. They were projecting an illusion of wealth, an illusion they desperately needed me to fund. I paused near the mahogany hose stand by the front entrance, pretending to adjust the belt of my wool coat. I did not want to leave just yet. I needed to hear the exact moment reality caught up with them. I needed to witness the destruction of their carefully crafted superiority. Antoine's voice drifted through the corridor, impeccably polite and ruthlessly professional. He thanked Brad for providing the card and informed him he would process the transaction immediately. There was a heavy, expectant silence in the private room. My aunts and uncles were likely holding their breath, waiting for the golden son-in-law to make the problem go away. Then came the sound. It was a sharp electronic beep from the wireless payment terminal. It was not the pleasant chime of an approved transaction. It was the harsh, jarring buzz of a rejection. Antoine spoke again, his tone completely neutral. He informed Brad that the card had been declined and asked if he had another form of payment. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Brad exploded. His voice cracked as he yelled that Antoine's machine was broken. He aggressively insisted that he makes mid-six figures and his card does not get declined. He demanded Antoine run it again and stop embarrassing him in front of his wife's family. I leaned against the host stand, suppressing a genuine smile. I could hear Antoine pressing the buttons again. Another sharp beep pierced the air, declined again. Tasha started whining, her high-pitched voice cutting through the tension. She demanded Brad use his other card, complaining that her uncles were staring at them. I heard the rustle of leather as Brad hastily pulled another card from his wallet, slamming it onto the terminal. He muttered curses about bank fraud alerts and security holds, trying to save face. A third beep echoed into the hallway. Declined. The illusion was shattering into a million pieces right in front of their entire audience. My father, Marcus, suddenly intervened, his deep voice thick with manufactured authority. He told Brad to step aside and stop playing around with the bank. He announced that he would handle his own family's tab because he is the patriarch and he takes care of his own. He proudly told Antoine to put the entire $10,450 balance on his American Express. I actually held my breath for that one. My father had spent my entire childhood holding money over my head, telling me I would never survive without his financial guidance. He loved reminding me that I was a financial burden. I waited for the machine to process. Beep, declined. My mother, Vivian, shrieked. She immediately blamed me, screaming to the room that Jada must have done something to their accounts, that I was a hacker, that I was trying to destroy them. It was a desperate, pathetic reach to avoid admitting they were broke. She dug into her own purse, insisting she had a pristine credit line. She handed her card to Antoine. Beep, declined. A chorus of panicked whispers erupted among my aunts and uncles. They were suddenly realizing that the wealthy matriarch and patriarch, along with the rich white savior they all worshipped, did not have a single working credit card between them. They had ordered Wagyu beef and premium seafood on the assumption that I would quietly absorb the damage like I always did when I was younger. I heard the heavy, synchronized footsteps of the restaurant's security team moving past me. Antoine had signaled them. Two massive men in tailored black suits positioned themselves, blocking the double doors of the private dining room. Antoine's voice rose above the frantic arguing, no longer accommodating, but carrying the full weight of a corporate enforcer. He politely but firmly informed my family that 15 payment methods had just been declined. He stated that the total outstanding balance remained exactly $10,450. He then delivered the final crushing blow. He instructed the security team that nobody was permitted to leave the premises until the debt was settled in full, and if the balance was not cleared within the next 10 minutes, he would be forced to contact the Chicago Police Department for theft of services. I stood by the glass exit doors, listening to the frantic gasps and Tasha's sudden sobbing. They were completely trapped. The cold Chicago drizzle felt refreshing against my face as I stood under the heavy black awning of the restaurant, waiting for the valet to bring my car around. Inside that building, my family was facing the very real consequences of their financial delusions. I expected them to be stuck in there for hours, arguing with the security team and trying to negotiate a payment plan they could not possibly afford. I certainly did not expect the heavy glass doors to violently burst open just 3 minutes later. My mother, Vivian, marched out first. Her usual immaculate posture was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered animal. Behind her came my father, Marcus, looking thoroughly humiliated and enraged. Tasha was right on their heels, clutching Brad's arm. I noticed immediately what was missing from their perfect outfits. Brad's left wrist was completely bare. The flashy Rolex he had been tapping against the table all night was gone. My mother's earlobes were naked, too stripped of the 2-carat diamond studs she loved to flaunt at church. The manager had clearly demanded serious collateral before letting them step outside to hunt me down. Vivian did not even hesitate. She lunged at me with her hand raised, aiming a vicious slap right at my face. She screamed that I was a worthless, miserable disgrace who just humiliated them in front of our entire extended family. I caught her wrist mid-air. I did not flinch and I did not step back. I held her arm suspended between us, my grip firm and unyielding. She struggled against my hold, her eyes wide with a manic fury. She spat out that I was just jealous of her perfect daughter. She yelled that I was a bitter, lonely woman who could not stand the fact that my younger sister had secured a rich, successful white husband, while I had absolutely nobody to love me. She claimed I orchestrated this entire embarrassment just to ruin Tasha's perfect life out of pure spite. I shoved her hand back toward her chest, stepping right into her personal space. I kept my voice dangerously low but loud enough to cut through the sound of the rain hitting the pavement. I asked her why I would ever be jealous of a parasite. I reminded her of the $50,000 insurance settlement I received when I was 18 after a drunk driver shattered my leg. I reminded her how she and Dad convinced me to put that money into a joint family account for safekeeping. I watched my mother's face pale as I brought up the truth she had buried for 15 years. I reminded her how she drained every single cent of my settlement money to buy Tasha a brand new luxury car for college while telling me the bank had frozen the funds due to a legal error. I had to work 3 back-to-back night shifts cleaning office buildings with a permanent limp just to pay for my basic community college tuition. I looked at Tasha, who suddenly found the wet concrete incredibly interesting and refused to make eye contact. I stated clearly that I am not jealous of a woman who needs to steal from her injured sister just to look wealthy to strangers. That was when Brad decided to step in. He pushed past my father using his height and his finance bro bravado to try and intimidate me. He pointed a finger directly in my face, his voice dripping with that familiar corporate condescension. He told me to watch my mouth and stop acting like a dramatic child throwing a tantrum. He sneered that I had absolutely no idea how the real world works or what was actually at stake tonight. He leaned in closer, smelling of expensive cologne and cheap desperation. He yelled that my parents were weeks away from having their house foreclosed on by the bank. He screamed that they were about to lose everything they had ever worked for, and I was out here playing petty, spiteful games over a dinner bill instead of stepping up to help my family like a decent human being. I froze. The valet pulled my car up to the curb, but I did not move toward it. Losing their house. The words echoed in my mind, cutting through the noise of the rain and the city traffic. My parents were facing foreclosure. Suddenly, the entire evening clicked into place, making perfect sense. The random invitation after 3 years of total silence. The lavish private dining room. The sudden desire to make amends and welcome me back into the fold. This dinner was never about apologizing or healing our fractured relationship. It was a highly calculated trap. They needed money. More specifically, they needed the only asset I had that they could not touch. Before she passed away, my grandmother had bypassed my parents completely and left her historic brownstone entirely in my name. It was a prime piece of real estate in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood worth a small fortune. I looked at my father, who was staring at the ground. I looked at Brad, who was still glaring at me, expecting me to crumble under his harsh reprimand. They did not invite me to celebrate our family. They invited me to butter me up, guilt-trip me, and ultimately pressure me into signing over the deed to that brownstone. They needed my property to save themselves from their own financial ruin. I looked at the 4 of them shivering in the cold rain without their watches and diamonds. Brad thought telling me about the foreclosure would shame me into submission. He thought dropping a financial crisis in my lap would make me panic and blindly follow his lead. He thought he was the smartest man in the alleyway dealing with an ignorant, stubborn woman. I slowly let out a breath, realizing the absolute depth of their manipulation. They had engineered this massive, expensive dinner with money. They did not even have fully intending to emotionally blackmail me into handing over a multi-million-dollar property. The audacity was almost impressive. My father, Marcus, stepped forward, pushing past my mother and dropping the wounded patriarch act completely. The mask was off. His face hardened into the stern, demanding expression he always used when he expected absolute obedience from his children. He commanded me to stop looking at him with that disrespectful attitude and listen carefully. He stated that family sacrifices for family. He demanded I sign over the deed to the historic brownstone my late grandmother left me. He did not ask. He ordered. He claimed it was the absolute only way to save their house from imminent foreclosure. I stared at him, letting the icy rain hit my face. That brownstone was a flawless piece of 19th century architecture in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. My grandmother had specifically bypassed him in her will, leaving the property exclusively to me, because she knew he would squander it to fund his obsession with looking wealthy. She had seen right through his pathetic country club aspirations and his desperate need to impress people who did not even like him. Now he stood under a restaurant awning, shivering without a coat, demanding the very asset she had legally protected from his incompetent hands. Before I could respond, Tasha grabbed her stomach, pushing herself aggressively into my line of sight. She wailed that she was pregnant. She cried huge theatrical tears, claiming she was bringing a new innocent life into this world and I was being a selfish monster by hoarding an empty 3-story building while my own flesh and blood faced the streets. She completely ignored the fact that she and Brad had been living in a luxury penthouse for the past 2 years, taking exotic vacations to Tulum and Aspen, while my parents apparently drowned in mounting debt. Tasha always weaponized her milestones to extract money from the family, and this alleged pregnancy was just her latest leverage. My father added that Brad had put together a brilliant bridge investment plan. He said Brad just needed the brownstone as collateral to secure the private funding that would bail out their mortgage and provide a substantial nest egg for Tasha's new baby. I looked at Brad. The white savior who had just had 3 different credit cards declined for a steak dinner was supposedly going to execute a high-level real estate maneuver using my inheritance as a bargaining chip. The sheer level of financial illiteracy my parents possessed to trust this arrogant fraud over their own daughter was staggering. Brad stepped up again, clearly sensing my silent, harsh judgment. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain the dominant alpha status he had so publicly lost inside the restaurant. He used his slickest Wall Street tone, dripping with corporate jargon meant to confuse and intimidate me. He told me to be reasonable, Jada. He claimed this was a standard collateralized debt obligation, leveraging high-yield physical assets to restructure non-performing liabilities. He actually used those ridiculous words while standing in a puddle in a parking lot. He condescendingly explained that I simply was not sophisticated enough to understand the complex mechanics of the current real estate market. He told me to just sign the deed over to his holding company and let the seasoned professionals handle the heavy lifting. He magnanimously promised to cut me a small equity check once the market stabilized. When I simply crossed my arms and stared at him, unimpressed, his tone turned viciously aggressive. He threatened that if I did not cooperate, his elite legal team would tie me up in probate court for the next decade. He snarled that he would personally bury me in legal fees until I was forced to sell the brownstone, just to pay my attorneys. He actually believed he could bully a black woman into giving up a multi-million-dollar property to fund his wife's fake designer collection and my parents' failed attempts at high society. I threw my head back and laughed. I laughed loudly and genuinely right into the freezing Chicago rain. The sound echoed off the wet pavement. My father looked absolutely appalled. My mother looked ready to lunge and scream again. Tasha clutched her stomach, looking utterly confused by my lack of fear. I stopped laughing and looked Brad up and down, taking in his damp designer suit, his tight jaw, and his completely bare wrist. I asked him clearly and deliberately if he was still a senior portfolio manager at Vanguard. Brad straightened up immediately, seizing the opportunity to flaunt his corporate title. He confidently stated that he was indeed a senior portfolio manager, and that his senior position was exactly why I needed to shut my mouth and listen to his financial directives. I smirked, looking him dead in the eye. I told him that if he was such a high-level executive, he should probably check his work email immediately. I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice sharp and precise so he would catch every single syllable. I mentioned that I heard Vanguard initiated a massive internal audit on Friday afternoon, specifically targeting certain portfolio managers who were mishandling client accounts. I smiled sweetly and told him good luck dealing with that massive credit card debt, Brad. I turned away, just as the valet pulled my sleek black car up to the curb. I handed the valet a crisp $100 bill, stepping gracefully into the driver's seat. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Brad was standing completely frozen. His face was ashen white, illuminated by the restaurant's flickering neon sign, looking exactly like a man who had just seen a ghost. The long weekend passed with absolute radio silence on my end, while I calmly reviewed all of my legal options. I ignored the 94 missed calls and the unhinged text messages promising my complete destruction. I knew they were panicking and scrambling to find a way out of their debt. I knew the reality of their impending foreclosure, and Brad's collapsing house of cards had consumed their entire Sunday. When Monday morning arrived, crisp and bright, I drank my dark espresso in silence and prepared for the inevitable invasion. They were desperate, and desperate people always make loud, careless mistakes. At precisely 9:15 today, the serene atmosphere of my investment firm's top-floor lobby was violently shattered. My firm occupies the entire 42nd floor of a premier glass high-rise in Chicago's financial district. The aesthetic is quiet wealth featuring imported Italian marble floors, minimalist modern art, and absolute tranquility. That tranquility died the second the elevator doors chimed open and my family spilled out. Vivian, Marcus, Tasha, and Brad bypassed the ground floor security by tailgating a legitimate executive and riding their coattails up to my domain. They marched straight toward the custom mahogany reception desk like an invading army. My receptionist, Sarah, is a seasoned professional who has handled aggressive hedge fund managers and difficult billionaires without ever losing her polite smile. She stood up, greeting them calmly, asking if they had a scheduled appointment. Vivian did not even let Sarah finish her sentence. My mother slammed her purse down onto the pristine wood surface and ordered Sarah to stop playing games. She demanded that Sarah go to the back office and fetch Jada, the assistant, right this second. Vivian's voice echoed off the high ceilings, shrill and completely devoid of any basic social etiquette. She proclaimed loudly that she was my mother, and she was here to collect the assets I had stolen from my own flesh and blood. Tasha stood right behind Vivian, aggressively chewing gum and looking around the luxurious lobby with a sneer. Tasha scoffed, telling Sarah to hurry up because they did not have all day to wait for a low-level secretary to finish fetching coffee for the real executives. Tasha truly believed I spent my days organizing filing cabinets and taking lunch orders. Her profound ignorance was almost comical, but it perfectly highlighted how little they valued my intelligence. In Tasha's mind, she was the only successful daughter because she married a white man in finance while I was just the bitter spinster sister pushing papers around a cubicle to barely make rent. Then Brad stepped forward, completely dropping his fake progressive ally persona. He puffed out his chest, trying to dominate the space using his aggressive white finance bro tactics. He placed both hands flat on the reception desk, leaning his weight forward to intimidate Sarah. Brad demanded that Sarah pick up her phone and call the chief executive officer of this firm immediately. He barked that he was the senior portfolio manager at Vanguard, and he demanded a meeting with the head of the company to discuss the immediate termination of their insubordinate employee. He claimed I was a massive liability to their corporate structure and that I was currently involved in a malicious scheme to defraud his family out of millions of dollars in real estate. Brad actually threatened to leverage his supposed Wall Street connections to ruin this firm's reputation if they did not fire me on the spot. He pointed a finger at Sarah, telling her if she did not produce Jada within 60 seconds, he would have her fired too. He used all the empty corporate jargon he could muster, claiming my actions were a breach of fiduciary duty and a violation of basic compliance protocols. I was desperately trying to sound like a titan of industry, but to anyone who actually worked in high-level finance, he sounded like a panicking amateur drowning in his own incompetence. Sarah simply looked at Brad with a completely blank expression. She did not flinch or reach for the phone. She just stared at him like he was a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. My father, Marcus, decided to join the circus, raising his voice to declare that family hierarchy overrides corporate rules. He shouted that he is the patriarch and he demands absolute obedience from his children no matter where they work. I demanded that someone bring him the deed to the brownstone right now, or he would personally tear the office apart looking for it. They were putting on a spectacular show of entitlement and financial illiteracy right in the middle of a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. Sarah calmly pressed a single hidden button under her desk. She did not call security. She simply notified me that the entertainment had arrived. Brad slammed his fist against the marble one last time, screaming that he was done playing nice and that he was going to walk back there and drag me out himself. He took exactly one step toward the secured hallway before the environment shifted. The massive, heavy frosted glass doors of the executive suite slid open with a quiet mechanical hiss. The harsh voices of my family instantly died in their throats. They all froze, staring at the entrance. I stepped out of the executive suite. I was not wearing an assistant's cardigan or holding a tray of coffees. I was wearing a bespoke tailored power suit that cost more than Tasha's entire fake designer wardrobe. I walked with the absolute authority of a woman who owned the building. But it was not just my attire that silenced them. It was the terrifying wall of power walking directly behind me. Flanking me on my left were three of the most ruthless corporate litigators in Chicago holding thick legal files. And walking right beside me, looking absolutely livid, was Vanguard's executive vice president. He was Brad's ultimate corporate boss. The heavy frosted glass doors of the executive suite slid completely open, and the temperature in the lobby seemed to plummet to freezing. I stood there in my custom midnight blue suit, looking directly at the four people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. But it was not my presence that made the air evaporate from Brad's lungs. It was the tall, silver-haired man standing furiously to my right. David was the executive vice president of Vanguard. He was a ruthless Wall Street veteran who practically controlled the Chicago financial district. And he was currently staring at my brother-in-law like he had just tracked mud across a priceless painting. Brad, what the hell are you doing harassing our firm's biggest venture capital partner? David's voice echoed off the Italian marble floors. It was not a question. It was a corporate execution delivered in front of my entire reception staff. Brad physically recoiled. His broad shoulders slumped, and the arrogant finance bro chest puffing he had been doing just seconds ago vanished completely. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at David, then looked at me, his eyes darting back and forth as his brain short-circuited, trying to process the impossible reality standing in front of him. Mr. Sterling. Brad finally stammered, his voice cracking like a terrified teenager. Sir, there is a misunderstanding. I am just here to collect my wife's sister. Jada works here as an assistant. She is family and she is causing some personal trouble for us. David stepped forward, his face turning an angry shade of crimson. An assistant? Are you completely out of your mind? Brad, Jada does not work here. She owns this entire firm. She is the founder and majority shareholder of the very institution that provides the primary liquidity for your entire department at Vanguard. You are standing in her building yelling at her staff and threatening the woman who single-handedly keeps your portfolio afloat. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. I watched the words hit my family like physical blows. Tasha actually stumbled backward, her fake Chanel bag slipping from her shoulder and hitting the floor with a dull thud. Her eyes were wide, darting around the luxurious high-tech lobby, finally seeing it not as a place where her sister fetched coffee, but as an empire her sister had built from the ground up. The years Tasha spent mocking my little office job, the decades my mother spent telling her friends I was a struggling administrative worker, the countless family dinners where they treated me like a financial burden, all of it crumbled into dust in the span of 30 seconds. My mother Vivian looked like she was struggling to breathe. She looked at the imported marble, the modern art on the walls, the three high-powered corporate attorneys standing dutifully behind me, holding thick legal files. The reality of my wealth, my actual undeniable systemic wealth, was suffocating her. She had spent my entire life trying to control me by withholding money, and now she was standing in a multi-million-dollar fortress that I owned outright. Brad was currently experiencing a full-blown panic attack. The sweat was visibly beading on his forehead. The white savior complex he loved to parade around my black family was completely obliterated. He was not the rich savior anymore. He was a mid-level employee caught terrorizing a billionaire partner. Sir, I had no idea. Brad pleaded, holding his hands up toward David in a desperate gesture of surrender. I swear to you, Mr. Sterling, I had no idea she was the owner. My father-in-law Marcus told me she was just a secretary here. We are dealing with a family real estate crisis, and I was just trying to help them secure a property deed. Do not drag me into your incompetence, Brad, David barked, cutting him off effortlessly. I already flagged your accounts on Friday for suspicious activity, and now you show up here committing corporate suicide. You are a liability. We will deal with your employment status the second I get back to the office, assuming you still have a job by the end of the day." Brad looked like he was going to vomit right there on the pristine lobby floor. He turned to look at my father, silently begging Marcus to do something to play the patriarch and fix this disaster. Marcus stepped forward desperately, trying to salvage his shattered authority. He puffed out his chest, trying to ignore the security guards who were now slowly circling behind them. He pointed a finger at me, falling back on the only tactic he knew. "Jada, what is the meaning of this?" Marcus demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and greedy excitement. "If you own this company, if you have this kind of money, why did you let your mother and me suffer? Why did you hide this from your own blood? You have a duty to this family. As your father, I demand you call off this man and transfer the funds to save our house immediately. We are family, and what is yours belongs to this family." Vivian immediately caught on to the new strategy. The shock on her face was instantly replaced by a greedy, manipulative smile. She stepped toward me, holding her arms out like she was greeting a long-lost friend. "Jada, my sweet girl." Vivian cooed, completely ignoring the fact that she had just been screaming at my receptionist. "You did it. You really made it big. Mommy is so proud of you. I always knew you were my smartest child. Now tell your security to stand down so we can go to your office and figure out how to pay off Brad's debt and save your parents' home." I looked at the woman who had stolen my accident settlement money. I looked at the father who demanded my obedience while offering absolutely zero protection. I looked at the sister who enjoyed watching me suffer, and the arrogant brother-in-law who thought he could bully me into submission. They actually believed that discovering my wealth meant they now had access to it. They believed they could just pivot from abusing me to exploiting me without skipping a single beat. I did not smile. I did not yell. I simply turned to the head of my security detail, a massive former Marine who had been waiting for my signal. "I do not want them causing a scene in my reception area." I instructed my security team, my voice cold and echoing through the lobby. "Escort my family and this Vanguard employee into conference room A immediately. Do not let them leave. We have some serious legal matters to settle, and I want everything on the record." I turned on my heel and walked back through the frosted glass doors, leaving them no choice but to follow the guards into the trap I had meticulously prepared for them. The heavy footsteps of my security team echoed against the polished marble as they corralled my family down the executive corridor. I did not look back. I led the way into conference room A, a massive space encased entirely in soundproof floor-to-ceiling glass. It was a room designed for high-stakes corporate warfare, not toxic family reunions. The door clicked shut, severing us from the polite murmurs of my staff outside. The silence inside was absolute and suffocating. I took my seat at the head of the 20-foot solid mahogany table. I did not invite them to sit. My security guards positioned themselves at the entrance, standing like stone statues. Vivian, Tasha, and Brad hovered awkwardly near the door, their eyes darting around the room, taking in the panoramic views of the Chicago skyline. They looked incredibly small against the backdrop of real power. Tasha clutched her fake designer bag against her chest, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and overwhelming jealousy. Brad was completely mute. The aggressive finance bro, who had been barking orders in my lobby just minutes ago, was now staring at the floor, perfectly aware that he was trapped in a room with the woman who controlled his entire career. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick crimson-red legal folder. I dropped it onto the center of the mahogany table. The sharp smack of the heavy cardstock hitting the wood made my mother physically jump. Vivian opened her mouth, stepping forward with that fake, manipulative, maternal smile she always used when she wanted to extract money from someone. She started to say my name, but the sound of the folder hitting the table seemed to snap my father out of his momentary paralysis. Marcus has never been able to handle being the weakest man in a room. The realization that his estranged daughter held more power and wealth than his golden son-in-law was breaking his brain. He marched toward the table, completely ignoring my mother trying to summon the booming authoritarian voice he used to terrorize me during my childhood. He placed his hands flat on the polished mahogany and leaned over, attempting to tower over me. He told me to wipe that smug look off my face. He yelled that he did not care how many glass walls I bought or how many lawyers I hired to stand behind me. He stated that I was still his daughter, and in his family the father dictates the rules. I demanded that I stop this ridiculous corporate theater and hand over the deed to the historic brownstone immediately. He claimed that family hierarchy demands obedience, and I had a fundamental obligation to submit my assets to the patriarch to secure the family legacy. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and yelled that he fed me, clothed me, and put a roof over my head for 18 years. He argued that the brownstone was a family asset, completely ignoring the fact that my grandmother specifically amended her will to keep it out of his reckless hands because he had already gambled away my college fund on failed business ventures. He insisted that I owed them my absolute loyalty, demanding I sign the property over to Brad right now so they could finalize their bridge loan and save his house. Marcus actually had the audacity to sneer and tell me that I was just a woman playing business and that I needed a seasoned financial mind like Brad to manage my portfolio before I lost it all. The sheer level of misogyny and financial illiteracy pouring out of his mouth was staggering. He was actively losing his own home to foreclosure, yet he stood in my multi-million-dollar boardroom trying to lecture me about asset management. I did not blink. I did not shrink back into my executive chair. I sat perfectly still, letting his desperate patriarchal rant fill the sterile room. I looked at the sweat forming on his brow and the frantic, wild look in his eyes. I was not a commanding patriarch. He was a drowning man clutching at a ghost. I slowly unclasped the metal fastener of the red legal folder. I peeled back the cover. The crisp sound of paper rustling was the only noise in the room. I extracted a single, notarized document and placed my fingertips on the edge of it. I looked at my father, then shifted my gaze to Brad, who was visibly trembling near the door, sweating through his expensive tailored suit. I slid the document across the long mahogany table. It glided perfectly, stopping exactly inches from my father's hands. I kept my voice incredibly calm, devoid of any warmth or mercy. I asked him if he really thought I would hold on to an empty, crumbling building while I was busy building an empire. I told him he wanted the brownstone, but he was exactly 2 years too late. I explained that I sold the property 24 months ago to a commercial developer to seed my very first investment fund. I watched the blood completely drain from his face as I delivered the final crushing reality. I told them your safety net does not exist. The echo of my words hung in the sterile air of the conference room. Your safety net does not exist. Tasha let out a sharp shriek. She scrambled forward, her hands slamming against the polished mahogany table, staring at the empty space where she thought her bailout was going to be. She yelled that I could not have sold the brownstone. I just sat there watching her fabricated reality collapse. She turned wildly to our mother, grasping at Vivian's silk blouse. She looked absolutely completely terrified. Vivian was already hyperventilating. The sudden realization that her only ticket out of financial ruin was gone sent her into clinical shock. Vivian spun around to face Brad. She grabbed his arm, her voice cracking with desperate entitlement. She begged him to use his Wall Street connections to fix this mess, to find a legal loophole for their mortgage crisis. She looked at this white man like he was a god who could rewrite reality to suit their needs. Brad stood completely frozen, his tailored suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. Sweat poured down his temples in thick drops. He could not even look my mother in the eye. He just stared at the thick red folder on the table as if it were a live grenade. I did not let the silence linger for another second. I told Vivian she was asking the wrong person for salvation. I reached into my legal folder and pulled out a fresh stack of documents. These papers were stamped with a confidential Vanguard internal audit seal. I dropped the heavy stack onto the table right in front of Brad. He flinched, visibly recoiling from the paperwork as if it physically burned his hands. I looked directly at my mother and asked her why she thought Brad could save anyone when he could not even save himself from federal prison. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool wood. I told the room that Brad is not a financial genius. I stated clearly that Brad is not a wealthy corporate titan, and he is definitely not your savior. I tapped the audit file and announced that Brad is a common thief. Tasha stopped shrieking and glared at me, her face twisted in ugly denial. She shouted that I was just a jealous, bitter woman trying to ruin her perfect marriage because Brad makes more in a single month than I used to make in an entire year. She aggressively defended the illusion of her life, screaming about their luxury downtown penthouse, their constant vacations to Tulum, and the imported cars they drove. She demanded I stop making up pathetic, jealous lies. I smoothly opened the audit file and began reading the highlighted sections aloud. I did not raise my voice. I let the cold financial facts do the cutting. I read off the exact dates and dollar amounts of multiple unauthorized wire transfers. I detailed how Brad had been systematically siphoning funds from his elderly clients' retirement accounts for 24 months. I looked up at Tasha and asked her how she honestly thought Brad paid for that lavish trip to Aspen last winter. I asked how she thought he afforded the cash down payment on her luxury SUV when his base salary barely covered the rent on their expensive penthouse. I flipped to the next page, revealing credit card statements that painted a picture of absolute financial desperation. I told Tasha that her entire curated social media aesthetic was funded entirely by stolen money. I listed the cash advances Brad took out to pay for her fake designer bags, to fund her lavish dinners, and to maintain the ridiculous facade they projected to the world. I looked Brad dead in the eye and reminded him of all the times he sat at my parents' dinner table making passive-aggressive microaggressions about my credit score. I reminded him how he loved to talk down to me using big corporate buzzwords to make himself feel vastly superior to a black woman who he incorrectly assumed was struggling beneath him. I pointed at the open audit file and told him that while he was busy playing a rich finance bro on the weekends, he was actually drowning in a sea of federal felonies during the week. I told my family that Brad did not have a prestigious platinum card with no limit. He had a mountain of margin calls, a suspended trading license, and a highly motivated team of federal investigators breathing down his neck. The air in the glass conference room grew impossibly heavy and toxic. Vivian let go of Brad's arm, slowly stepping away from him, as if his sudden lack of wealth was a highly contagious disease. Tasha was shaking her head back and forth, whispering that it was not true, that Brad would never do that to her. Marcus stood perfectly still, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. He had worshipped Brad, giving him the immense respect and admiration he actively withheld from his own daughter, and now he was realizing he had bowed down to a complete fraud. But I was not finished. The dismantling of Brad's fake empire was just the appetizer. I reached into my folder one last time. I pulled out a single crisp document, with a notarized government seal stamped clearly at the top. I looked at Marcus and Vivian, watching their panicked eyes track the paper in my hand. I told them that Brad did not just steal from his firm and his clients to fund Tasha's delusions. I slid the document across the mahogany table, sending it straight toward my father's shaking hands. I told them to look closely at the collateral listed on Brad's latest defaulted bank loan. I watched Marcus pick up the paper, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. His face drained of all remaining color, and his knees buckled slightly, forcing him to grab the edge of the table for physical support. I leaned back in my executive chair and delivered the fatal blow, telling them that it is the deed to their house. Marcus stared at the document, trembling in his hands. He fumbled in his suit jacket, pulling out his reading glasses. He shoved them onto his face and brought the paper inches from his eyes. I watched his lips move silently as he read the dense legal text. The conference room was so quiet you could hear the breathing coming from my mother. Marcus finally found his voice, but it was a hollow wheeze. He looked up at Brad and asked what a home equity line of credit was. I demanded to know why a bank issued a loan for $800,000 against a property that he had fully paid off 10 years ago. Brad took a step backward, bumping hard into the glass wall. He could not make eye contact with the man who had worshipped him. He just stared down at his leather shoes, his face slick with terrified sweat. I leaned forward and told Marcus that his son-in-law had drained his client accounts and was facing massive margin calls. I explained that a margin call happens when a broker demands you deposit more cash immediately to cover investments. Brad was desperate to keep his superiors at Vanguard from finding out he was bleeding stolen money, so he looked for the fastest source of untraceable cash he could find. He looked right at his overly trusting in-laws, who owned a beautiful home free and clear of any mortgage. Marcus slammed his fist onto the solid mahogany table, making the surface vibrate. He roared that he never signed any loan documents. He turned his gaze to Vivian, demanding to know if she had authorized this transaction behind his back. Vivian shook her head frantically, sending her hair into disarray. She swore with tears streaming down her face that she never signed anything for Brad. Marcus pointed a shaking finger at the signature line on the document. He shouted that someone forged their names perfectly. He lunged toward Brad, screaming that Brad was a criminal who stole their home. I tapped my gold pen against the table, drawing their frantic attention back to me. I told my father he was only half right. I instructed him to look closely at the second signature on the loan application. I told him to look at the official notary public stamp at the bottom of the page. Marcus squinted at the paper again, adjusting his glasses. He read the notary name out loud. It was a woman named Jessica. I smiled coldly and reminded my father that Jessica is Tasha's best friend from her sorority days. I watched my parents slowly turn their heads toward their golden child. Tasha shrank back against the glass, her shoulders hunched in absolute terror. I explained the exact mechanics of their ultimate betrayal. I told my parents that Brad could not access their personal financial records on his own. He needed someone on the inside. He needed someone who knew where they kept their tax returns, their social security numbers, and their original physical property deed. I needed the daughter who had a spare key to their house and free rein to snoop through their home office while they were busy attending church on Sunday mornings. Tasha burst into loud, frantic tears. She threw her hands up in the air, desperately trying to justify her felony. She cried that Brad told her it was just a temporary bridge loan to fix a minor accounting error. She screamed that Brad promised he would double the money in the stock market and pay the bank back before the first statement even arrived in the mail. She sobbed that they desperately needed to maintain their elite lifestyle because she was pregnant and she could not bear the thought of raising her baby in a downgraded apartment. She looked at our parents and wailed that she was just trying to secure her growing family's financial future, and that she never meant for the bank to actually initiate foreclosure proceedings. The illusion of the perfect golden child shattered instantly. Vivian gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck by a heavy blow. The daughter she had worshipped, the daughter she had bought a luxury car for, using my accident settlement money, had just confessed to orchestrating the theft of their family home. Marcus looked completely broken. The fierce patriarch who walked into my office demanding my obedience was now a ruined man standing over a piece of paper that proved his entire life was a lie. The people he trusted had utterly destroyed him while the daughter he discarded had built an empire. The silence that followed Tasha's pathetic confession was suffocating. Then a fierce survival instinct kicked in. Vivian's eyes darted wildly around the room, landing on the sleek custom furniture, the three high-powered lawyers standing directly behind me, and the breathtaking view of the Chicago financial district. Her brain immediately discarded her anger toward Tasha and focused entirely on my visible wealth. She saw an escape hatch. Vivian began to weep loudly, her sobs echoing off the glass walls. She threw herself forward, leaning her entire body across the massive mahogany table. She reached out and grabbed my hand with a desperate claw-like grip. Her tears stained the polished wood. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes, completely abandoning the fierce hatred and jealousy she had shown me in the restaurant parking lot. She cried out my name, calling me her sweet baby girl. She begged me to help them. She screamed that I am rich now and I have millions of dollars at my disposal. She pleaded with me to just pay off Brad's massive debt to the bank so they would not lose their house to foreclosure. She tightened her grip on my hand, sobbing that we are family, and family always takes care of each other no matter what. Vivian's fingers dug into my skin. Her desperate tears splashed against my knuckles. She kept repeating that we were blood, that I had a moral duty to rescue them. But before I could respond, a loud thud echoed through the glass conference room. Tasha had collapsed. Her knees hit the polished marble floor with a heavy impact. The golden child, the flawless social media darling who had spent her entire existence looking down on me, was now kneeling at my feet. Tasha looked up at me, her mascara running down her cheeks. The haughty sneer she wore at the restaurant was completely erased. replaced by a performance of utter victimhood. She reached out her trembling hands, hovering just inches from my trousers, too afraid to actually touch me, but desperate enough to try. She placed one hand dramatically over her rounded stomach. She began to wail, begging me to think of her unborn child. She cried that her baby did not deserve to be born into a shelter, that she was going to be completely homeless because Brad had destroyed their lives. She pleaded with me, calling me her big sister, begging me to use my wealth to save her innocent baby from the devastating consequences of her husband's criminal actions. She spun a frantic tale of how she had been deceived, how she was just a naive wife who trusted the wrong man. She sobbed that if I did not step in and pay off the massive debt Brad had accumulated, the bank would throw them all out onto the street. She wailed that the stress was going to cause a miscarriage, weaponizing her pregnancy in real time to force my hand. It was the ultimate manipulation tactic, perfectly executed by a woman who had spent 30 years learning exactly how to extract sympathy and resources from everyone around her. I stared down at her. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the protective sisterly instinct she was trying to invoke. All I felt was a cold clarity. I looked at her tear-stained face and the hand resting on her stomach, and I felt nothing but utter disgust. I kept my voice perfectly level, refusing to let her theatrical display dictate the volume of our conversation. I asked her if she really expected me to believe she was a helpless victim. I asked her if she thought pregnancy somehow gave her a free pass for committing felony fraud against our own parents. Tasha choked on a sob, shaking her head wildly, insisting she had no idea Brad was stealing. I cut her off immediately. I told her to stop insulting my intelligence. I reminded her of the designer baby clothes she had been flaunting online, the luxury nursery renovations in her penthouse, the constant stream of imported luxury goods she paraded in front of my face for years. I told her that she knew exactly where that money was coming from, and she did not care as long as it kept her looking superior. Then I brought up the past. I leaned forward in my executive chair, my eyes locking onto her terrified gaze. I asked Tasha if she remembered a very specific Tuesday night 14 years ago. I watched her breath hitch. I painted the picture for the entire room, forcing my parents to listen to the history they had conveniently forgotten. I was 19 years old. I had been working consecutive night shifts, saving every single dollar I earned to finally pay my own way through university because they refused to help me. I had a cashier's check sitting on the kitchen counter ready to cover my tuition. I reminded Tasha how she had marched into the kitchen throwing a massive tantrum because she had maxed out her credit cards on a spring break trip and needed to pay her own tuition bill. I reminded my mother, whose hand was still frantically clutching mine, how she had demanded I hand over my hard-earned money to Tasha. Vivian had claimed that Tasha was the smart one, the one with real potential, and that my degree was a waste of resources. When I refused, Marcus had physically packed my bags in garbage sacks and thrown them onto the front porch. I looked down at Tasha, who was now trembling violently on the marble floor. I reminded her of her exact reaction that night. I told the room that as I stood on the porch in the freezing cold, holding my trash bags with nowhere to go, and my educational future entirely derailed, Tasha had stood in the warm doorway and laughed. I recalled the exact sound of her laughter, sharp and victorious. She had smirked at me and told me I was exactly where I belonged out on the street. She had taken my money, taken my parents' unconditional support, and watched me become homeless without shedding a single tear. I asked Tasha why my memory of her laughing at my ruin was suddenly supposed to be erased just because she was crying on my floor today. I asked her why she thought her unborn child entitled her to the very financial salvation she had actively stolen from me 14 years ago. Vivian squeezed my hand, tighter fingernails digging deep. She screamed that the past was the past and we needed to focus on the emergency. She pleaded that they were going to lose the family home. She demanded that I use my venture capital funds to pay off the bank immediately. She wailed that I had to pay the bank to save them. I ripped my hand out of her frantic grip. The sudden movement made Vivian stumble backward, her false maternal mask slipping. I straightened my tailored blazer, my expression turning to absolute ice. I stared directly into my mother's panicked eyes as she waited for my answer. Pay off the bank. Why would I pay the bank, Mom? Vivian blinked, her desperate grip completely severed, leaving her hand hovering in the sterile air of the conference room. She looked at me as if I had spoken to her in a foreign language, completely unable to process a reality where her demands were not instantly met. Marcus stepped closer to the mahogany table, his face a map of conflicting emotions. He was torn between his natural, deeply ingrained urge to demand absolute obedience and his newfound, creeping terror of my actual corporate power. He demanded to know what I was talking about. He insisted loudly that if I had the cash sitting around, I had a fundamental duty to wire it to their lender immediately and clear his name. He was still trying to give patriarchal orders from a rapidly sinking ship, completely blind to the fact that the water was already over his head. I did not even look at him. I simply raised my right hand and gave a subtle two-finger gesture to my lead attorney. Thomas, a razor-sharp corporate litigator who bills out at $1,000 an hour, did not say a single word. He stepped forward with absolute military precision and placed a heavy folio directly in front of me on the table. The heavy thud of the portfolio hitting the polished wood sent a visible tremor through Brad. The golden son-in-law was still backed up against the glass wall, sweating profusely through his designer shirt, finally realizing he had picked a fight with a woman who could buy and sell his entire existence before her morning coffee. I rested my hands on the black leather, feeling the satisfying weight of the documents inside. I looked down at Tasha, who was still kneeling awkwardly on the cold marble floor. Her fake tears were drying up quickly as sheer confusion replaced her manufactured panic. I told her to get off the floor because her theatrical performance was completely useless in my boardroom. I told her that I was not a charity organization, and I certainly was not a bank teller she could manipulate with fake crying and a pregnancy. Then I turned my attention fully back to my parents. I asked them if they ever actually bothered to look up what my venture capital firm does on a day-to-day basis. I reminded them that for the past decade, they were far too busy bragging to their church friends about Brad managing imaginary portfolios to ever ask their own daughter how she built a multi-million-dollar company from absolutely nothing. I told them that my firm does not just buy up bankrupt restaurants and flip them for a quick profit. We specialize in distressed assets. We deal in the exact financial ruin that they deliberately abandoned me to when I was 19 years old. I opened the black portfolio, turning the crisp, thick pages with deliberate slowness. I told them about those brutal years after they threw me out on the street to fund Tasha's luxury lifestyle. I told them about working 3 different night shifts, surviving on cheap instant noodles, and fighting off predatory student loan companies who harassed me day and night. I explained that while they were busy taking out reckless loans to buy Tasha designer clothes she did not earn, I was busy learning exactly how the American debt system operates. I learned how banks package bad loans. I learned how they bundle the debt of desperate, financially illiterate people and sell it off for pennies on the dollar to private equity firms. I did not just survive the crushing poverty they forced me into. I studied it relentlessly. I mastered the exact financial game that Brad spent his entire pathetic career pretending to understand. Brad let out a small, strangled gasp from the corner of the room. He knew exactly where this conversation was going. He understood the corporate mechanics I was describing perfectly, and the absolute horror of his inescapable situation was finally breaking through his arrogant facade. He realized I was not just a rich relative he could bully or gaslight. I was an apex predator operating at the very top of his own industry. I kept my eyes locked on my father's pale face. I explained that when a borrower defaults on a massive home equity line of credit, the bank does not actually want to deal with the messy, drawn-out process of foreclosure. They want to clear their balance sheets quickly and quietly. So they bundle those non-performing loans together and auction them off to high-liquidity investment firms. Firms exactly like mine. I slid my manicured finger down the long list of assets detailed in the heavy contract. I told Marcus that Brad's fraudulent loan was flagged by the bank's risk management department weeks ago because Brad abruptly stopped making the required margin call payments. The bank officially categorized the loan on their historic family home as a toxic, non-performing asset. They bundled it up with 50 other defaulted properties in the greater Chicago area and put it up for a private, closed-door auction. Vivian shook her head wildly, her voice trembling as she asked what I was saying. She pleaded with me to speak plain English and stop using complicated business words. She cried out, begging to know if the bank was going to take their house or not. I looked at my mother, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure. I had spent my entire childhood craving her validation, begging for a fraction of the love she showered unconditionally on Tasha. I had spent my 20s proving I could survive without her. Now in my 30s, I was looking at a woman who possessed absolutely no power over me. She was just a stranger begging for a bailout from a daughter she never bothered to love. I closed the black portfolio with a sharp, decisive snap. I stood up slowly, ensuring I towered over my seated mother and my kneeling sister. I looked down at the three people who had engineered my ruin and the fraudulent white savior they had chosen over me. I let the silence stretch, letting the weight of their total vulnerability fill the glass room. "I don't need to pay the bank to save your house," Jada says, her voice echoing in the glass room. "My firm bought the bank's non-performing loan portfolio last Thursday. I am your creditor. I own your debt. I own your house." The absolute silence in the glass conference room was heavy enough to crush bone. My words hung in the air, vibrating against the soundproof walls. "I own your debt. I own your house." Marcus and Vivian stared at me, their mouths parted in silent horror, finally comprehending the sheer magnitude of their own destruction. But it was Brad who shattered first. For a man like Brad, the world was built on a very specific, rigid hierarchy. In his mind, he was the apex predator of the financial district, the brilliant, sophisticated white savior who had graced a struggling black family with his presence and his supposed wealth. He had spent years patting my father on the back with that condescending smirk, treating my parents like amusing charity cases who needed his guidance. He had looked at me, a black woman who refused to worship his status, as an arrogant anomaly that needed to be put in her place. The realization that I was not an anomaly but the architect of his total financial ruin broke his brain entirely. I watched his face transition from pale terror to a sickening blotchy red. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The polished, progressive ally persona he wore to Thanksgiving dinners and country club outings melted away like wax over an open flame, revealing the ugly, rotting core of bigotry that had fueled every single microaggression he had ever directed at me. He slammed both his hands onto the mahogany table, leaning forward with his teeth bared like a cornered animal. He yelled that it was impossible. He screamed that there was absolutely no way a diversity hire like me could maneuver a portfolio acquisition of that scale. He refused to believe it. He shouted that I was lying, that I must have slept my way to the top or stolen corporate secrets because people from my background do not outsmart people from his. He practically spat the words across the wood, his voice echoing violently in the enclosed space. Tasha gasped, shrinking back against the glass wall. Marcus and Vivian froze, their eyes widening as they finally heard the unvarnished truth of how their beloved golden son-in-law truly viewed them and their kind. All those years of subtle insults, the backhanded compliments about my credit score, the patronizing advice about how the real corporate world works. It was never just finance bro arrogance. It was pure, unfiltered supremacy, and it was spilling out of him like toxic sludge. I did not raise my voice. I simply sat in my executive chair, my hands folded perfectly on top of the black portfolio, and told him that his denial would not change the deed in my hand. I calmly stated that his arrogance had blinded him to the reality of the market, and his profound incompetence had delivered his entire life directly into my possession. That was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Brad completely snapped. He let out a guttural, furious scream that sounded barely human. He vaulted forward, throwing his entire body weight across the wide conference table. He knocked over crystal water glasses and sent thick legal files scattering across the polished marble floor. His arms reached out, his fingers curled into claws, aiming directly for my throat. He shouted vile, unforgivable classist and racial slurs, screaming that I needed to be put back in my place, that I was nothing but uneducated trash masquerading in a designer suit. The ugly words battered against the glass walls, stripping away the last remaining shreds of his humanity. I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I did not need to. Before Brad could even clear the center of the mahogany table, my head of security moved. The massive former Marine stepped out of my peripheral vision with terrifying speed and precision. He intercepted Brad mid-air. One massive hand clamped down on the back of Brad's neck while the other gripped his tailored belt. The security guard hoisted Brad upward for a fraction of a second before slamming him brutally face first onto the solid wood surface. The impact sounded like a thunderclap. The breath rushed out of Brad's lungs in a violent whoosh, replaced instantly by a sharp groan of pain. The guard effortlessly pinned Brad's arms behind his back, pressing his knee squarely between Brad's shoulder blades, locking him entirely in place against the mahogany. Brad writhed and thrashed like a caught fish, his face squished against the table, spitting curses and threats that were muffled by the hard wood. He yelled that he would sue me, that he would destroy my firm, that I had no right to touch him. I leaned forward, looking down at his face, which was now pressed awkwardly against the very audit file detailing his extensive federal crimes. I calmly informed him that he was currently assaulting a senior partner in her own corporate headquarters, and that his threats were as worthless as his bank accounts. Tasha screamed, pressing her hands over her ears, completely paralyzed by the violent collapse of her perfect life. Vivian backed away, her hands covering her mouth, finally realizing that the man she had allowed to disrespect me for years was a violent racist criminal. Marcus just stared at the floor, absolutely humiliated, unable to look at me, unable to look at the man he had chosen as his surrogate son. They were trapped in the glass room, forced to watch the absolute destruction of their chosen champion. I looked up from Brad's struggling form as a heavy rhythmic pounding approached from the executive corridor. I had pressed a silent alarm button under the lip of the table the exact moment Brad had entered the lobby downstairs. I did not just call building security. The heavy frosted glass doors of Conference Room A burst open with a forceful slide. The polite, quiet atmosphere of the venture capital firm was completely shattered as two uniformed Chicago Police Department officers marched into the room. Their hands rested firmly on their duty belts, their eyes locking immediately onto the man pinned to my table. The lead officer stepped forward, the metallic jingle of handcuffs ringing out clearly in the silent, tense air of the boardroom. He looked directly at the struggling man and announced that they were looking for Brad, stating that they had a warrant for his immediate arrest. The lead officer did not wait for Brad to process the reality of his situation. He stepped forward with a heavy metallic clink of his handcuffs echoing in the soundproof glass room. My head of security smoothly released his grip and took a calculated step backward, allowing the Chicago Police Department to take full jurisdiction over the struggling finance manager. Brad frantically scrambled to his feet, wiping a streak of blood from his nose where his face had impacted the solid mahogany table. He immediately raised his hands and tried to deploy his usual arrogant corporate defense. He stammered that there was a massive administrative mistake. He commanded the officers to stand down, claiming that he was a senior portfolio manager at Vanguard, and that this was strictly a civil misunderstanding regarding client margin calls. He aggressively insisted that they needed to speak to his corporate legal counsel before making a false arrest that would ruin their careers. The second police officer grabbed Brad by the shoulder and forcibly spun him around, pressing him hard against the glass wall of the conference room. The officer unclipped his handcuffs and stated in a flat-bored voice that they already spoke to Vanguard's legal department. The officer read off the charges in a booming voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation. He announced that Brad was being arrested for multiple counts of felony wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. Brad thrashed against the glass, his face turning a blotchy purple as he looked wildly around the room. He locked eyes with me, his expression a mixture of pure terror and venomous hatred. He screamed that I set him up. He yelled that I somehow fabricated the internal audit and manipulated his boss to eliminate him. I remained perfectly still in my executive chair. I adjusted the cuffs of my bespoke blazer and looked at him with absolute pity. I calmly informed him that my venture capital firm does not forge audits. I told him that the chief executive officer of Vanguard personally pressed those criminal charges against him 48 hours ago. I explained that Vanguard had been tracking his illegal wire transfers for months, but they needed to quietly untangle his fraudulent accounts before moving in. They officially terminated his employment on Saturday morning. I looked at his sweaty, panicking face and clarified my exact role in his downfall. I told him I did not build the case against him. I merely called the authorities 30 minutes ago and provided them with his exact location so they could come collect their trash. The sharp snap of the metal handcuffs locking around Brad's wrists broke the spell that had paralyzed my sister. Tasha let out a blood-curdling shriek that pierced the sterile air of the boardroom. The golden child watched her entire identity crumble into dust right before her eyes. The luxury downtown penthouse, the imported cars, the lavish trips to Tulum, and the arrogant white husband who provided her with ultimate social superiority were all vanishing into the back of a police cruiser. Tasha lunged forward, throwing herself at the officers. She grabbed the sleeve of Brad's ruined designer suit, weeping hysterically and begging the police to let him go. She wailed that her husband was a brilliant financial mind and that they were making a terrible mistake. She screamed that she was pregnant and they could not take the father of her child away to prison. The lead officer firmly shoved Tasha back, warning her that if she interfered with a felony arrest, she would be placed in handcuffs for obstruction of justice. Tasha stumbled backward, hitting the mahogany table. She looked at Brad, sobbing uncontrollably, reaching her hands out to him. But Brad was no longer playing the loving, protective husband. His facade was completely destroyed. As the officers yanked him toward the door, he did not look at Tasha with love or regret. He glared at her and screamed that this was her fault. He yelled that he only stole the money because she never stopped demanding expensive things. He shouted that her fake lifestyle drained his bank accounts and forced him to embezzle just to keep her quiet. Tasha gasped, clutching her chest, as her husband threw her under the bus to save his own ego. Marcus and Vivian watched the entire exchange in absolute horrified shock. The man they had worshipped, the man they had trusted to save their home and elevate their social status, was being dragged away as a common thief, shouting insults at their favorite daughter. My parents had engineered this entire disastrous reunion, relying solely on Brad to intimidate me. Now they were backed into a corner, watching their engineered savior get hauled out the door. The officers pulled Brad through the heavy frosted glass doors of Conference Room A. He kicked and struggled, screaming racial and classist slurs at the top of his lungs. He shouted that he would sue my firm into the ground, that he would destroy me, that I was nothing. His voice echoed down the long executive corridor. I did not close the blinds. I let my parents and my sister watch the walk of shame. Through the glass walls, I watched every single one of my highly paid employees step out of their offices. Analysts, junior partners, and assistants all stood in the hallway, silently watching the arrogant man who had stormed their lobby just an hour ago get dragged toward the freight elevator in handcuffs. The humiliation was absolute and highly public. When the doors finally clicked shut, the silence inside the boardroom was deafening. Tasha remained slumped against the edge of the mahogany table, her chest heaving with heavy, erratic sobs. Her entire world had been surgically dismantled in under 20 minutes. She slowly lifted her head, her tear-stained face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She turned her venomous glare entirely onto me. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at my face and screamed that I planned this. She yelled that I was an evil, jealous monster who deliberately destroyed her family because I could not stand to see her happy. She blamed me for the arrest, for the embarrassment, and for ruining her unborn baby's life. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I simply picked up a sleek silver tissue box from the center of the table. I looked at the sister who had laughed when I was thrown out onto the street with nothing but trash bags. I slid the tissue box across the polished wood, watching it glide perfectly until it stopped right in front of her trembling hands. I met her furious gaze with complete indifference. "Save your tears, Tasha. You have a lot of packing to do." Tasha recoiled as if I had slapped her across the face. She opened her mouth to scream another accusation, but the sheer coldness in my voice finally seemed to penetrate her thick layer of delusion. She clamped her mouth shut and sank back against the heavy mahogany table, trembling uncontrollably. With her golden ticket to high society sitting in the back of a police cruiser, Tasha was neutralized. But nature abhors a vacuum, And in my family, whenever one manipulator falls, the matriarch immediately steps in to fill the void. Vivian straightened her posture, smoothing down the front of her expensive silk blouse. She took a deep breath, visibly forcing her panicked features into a mask of righteous indignation. She was entirely stripped of the arrogant son-in-law she had wielded like a weapon just 30 minutes ago. Now she had to rely on the only currency she had left, her absolute authority as a mother. She stepped away from the glass wall and marched toward my end of the table, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She pointed a rigid finger at me, channeling every ounce of generational guilt she had mastered over the past 3 decades. She commanded me to erase the debt right this instant. She yelled that I was speaking to the woman who carried me in her womb for 9 months, who endured the agonizing pain of childbirth to bring me into this world. She declared that her sacrifice gave her eternal dominion over everything I owned. She shouted that a mother's love is absolute and requires absolute submission in return. She demanded that I show some basic respect for the family hierarchy, insisting that no daughter of hers was going to evict her own parents. Vivian ranted that she had sacrificed her best years raising me, putting food on my plate and clothes on my back. She demanded that I sign over the mortgage paperwork to her, immediately claiming it was my fundamental duty as her child to absorb this loss so she could maintain her proper status in our community. She expected me to just write off an $800,000 loan as a simple thank you gift for not abandoning me at birth. The audacity was so profoundly ingrained in her psyche that she truly believed her biological connection granted her unlimited access to my bank accounts. I did not flinch. I did not avert my gaze. I sat perfectly still in my executive chair and let her finish her desperate, toxic monologue. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the closed legal portfolio. I told her that she needed to stop confusing basic biological functions with actual love. I stated that giving birth to me did not give her a blank check to finance her fake socialite lifestyle. I kept my voice devoid of any emotion, delivering the surgical cuts necessary to dissect her twisted version of motherhood. I asked her exactly what her maternal love looked like when I was growing up. I reminded her of my high school graduation, when she refused to take a single photo with me because my inexpensive dress did not fit the wealthy aesthetic she was trying to project to her country club friends. I brought up the financial sabotage she orchestrated when I turned 18. I reminded her how she deliberately ruined my credit score by secretly opening utility accounts in my name and letting them default just so she could afford to host lavish Sunday dinners to impress neighbors who secretly despised her. I pointed right back at her, refusing to let her hide behind the sacred shield of motherhood. I told her that she never loved me. She only loved the idea of using her children as props to elevate her fragile social standing. I explained that Tasha was the golden child because Tasha was willing to be a human accessory, marrying a white finance guy to give Vivian bragging rights at church. I was the scapegoat because I saw right through her pathetic obsession with status. I told Vivian that her love was conditional, transactional, and entirely fraudulent. I stated clearly that she did not raise a daughter, she raised a target, and I was absolutely done paying the emotional tolls for her profound insecurities. Vivian gasped, clutching her chest, as my words systematically destroyed her entire matriarchal narrative. She looked around the room, completely stripped of her power, realizing that her guilt trips held absolutely no currency in my corporate domain. That was when my father decided to jump back into the fray. Marcus could not stand watching his wife lose control, and he certainly could not handle the reality of being a completely powerless patriarch. He slammed his fist against the mahogany table, his face twisted in a desperate rage. He yelled that if I went through with this eviction, he would make sure my name was utterly destroyed in our community. He threatened to go to every single church member, every family friend, and every local business owner they knew. He promised to launch a relentless smear campaign, painting me as a vicious monster who threw her own elderly parents out onto the street. He shouted that he would ruin my reputation so thoroughly that I would never be able to show my face in this city again. He thought the threat of public shame would finally bring me to my knees. I simply looked at my father and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey walk directly into a trap. I reached under the lip of the heavy mahogany table and found the small, sleek control panel embedded in the wood. I pressed a single silver button. A low mechanical hum instantly filled the room. Heavy motorized blackout blinds began to descend rapidly over every single glass wall of the conference room, blocking out the view of my staff, the Chicago skyline, and the entire outside world. I looked at my father's confused face and told him to go ahead and try. I had just sealed them inside their own private cage of shame. The motorized blinds hit the bottom of the glass with a soft but final click. The ambient daylight from the Chicago skyline vanished, completely replaced entirely by the harsh and clinical fluorescence of the boardroom overhead lights. Marcus, Vivian, and Tasha were completely sealed off from the outside world. There was no audience left to perform for, no country club friends to impress with their fake wealth, no church members to gossip with, just the four of us trapped inside a soundproof box. I watched my father stare at the heavy gray fabric of the blinds, the last shred of his patriarchal dominance dissolving into the sterile air. He looked back at me, his chest heaving, waiting for me to scream or yell or show some kind of emotional weakness he could manipulate. I did none of those things. I simply turned my attention back to the heavy black portfolio sitting on the mahogany table. Vivian tried to speak again. She opened her mouth to launch into another tearful monologue about blood ties and Christian forgiveness, but I raised my hand, silencing her instantly. I told her that the emotional portion of this meeting was officially concluded. I stated that we were now shifting to the administrative phase of the asset transfer. I kept my voice incredibly flat, using the exact same cold and corporate detachment that Brad had weaponized against our family for years. They had always worshipped Brad because he spoke in spreadsheets and profit margins. They equated ruthlessness with success. So I decided to give them exactly the kind of successful executive interaction they had always craved. I extracted a thick packet of stapled papers from the portfolio. It was printed on heavy watermarked legal stock. I slid it deliberately across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of Marcus. I told my father to pick it up and read it. Marcus did not want to touch it. He looked at the packet like it was laced with a deadly poison. He kept his hands pressed firmly against his thighs, shaking his head slowly, muttering that he was not signing anything without his own personal lawyer present in the room. I smiled thinly. I informed him that he did not need to sign a single page. I explained that the document was not a negotiation or a proposal. It was a formal, legally binding notice of foreclosure and eviction, drafted by my firm's real estate division, and officially filed with the county clerk at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. Tasha gasped, her hands flying to her face as the word eviction bounced off the soundproof walls. Vivian let out a strangled sob, leaning heavily against the table. She pleaded with me, asking how I could do this to my own flesh and blood out of pure vindictiveness. I looked directly at my mother and corrected her without a single ounce of anger. I told her there was absolutely nothing vindictive about this transaction. I explained that I was acting solely in my capacity as a fiduciary for my venture capital firm. I reminded her that my firm purchased a bundled portfolio of toxic debt, and their house simply happened to be one of the non-performing assets in that specific package. I stated that as a businesswoman, I cannot carry dead weight on my balance sheets to subsidize people who refuse to work. I looked at the three of them and stated plainly that they were not my family right now. They were simply defaulting tenants occupying a commercial property they no longer owned. I watched Marcus finally reach out with trembling fingers. He picked up the eviction notice, pulling his reading glasses back down from the top of his head. As he read the harsh legal print, I reminded him of a conversation we had 14 years ago. I reminded him how he stood on the front porch watching me haul my trash bags into the freezing rain and told me that the real world does not care about my feelings. He had told me that in the real world, if you cannot pay your way, you get left behind. I kept my voice perfectly level as I thanked him for that valuable life lesson. I told him I took his advice to heart. I built an entire career on understanding exactly how the real world operates. I told Marcus that he took a massive financial gamble by letting a fraudster like Brad leverage his primary residence, and he completely lost. Now the market was simply correcting itself without any sentimental attachments. Tasha tried to interject, her voice high and desperate. She wailed that they had nowhere to go, that the rental market in Chicago required credit checks and massive security deposits. She cried that Brad had completely ruined their credit scores by tying their names to his fraudulent banking accounts. She shouted that no landlord in the entire state would ever rent to a family carrying a massive foreclosure and a pending federal investigation. I looked at my sister, watching the terrifying reality of absolute poverty wash over her pampered existence. I told Tasha that her housing logistics were not my corporate responsibility. I suggested she start looking into state-funded assistance programs, the very same programs she used to relentlessly mock on her social media accounts when she was busy pretending to be a wealthy socialite. I told her she would need to learn how to fill out food stamp applications instead of country club membership forms. Marcus finished reading the first page of the document. The paper shook violently in his hands, creating a sharp rattling noise in the painfully quiet room. All the color had vanished from his face, leaving him looking frail and utterly defeated. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. His voice broke into a hoarse whisper as he read the final stipulation aloud. He stated that the document gave them exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. 30 days. I nodded slowly, confirming the timeline. I told them that on the 31st day, my property management team would arrive with local law enforcement to remove any remaining occupants and permanently change the locks. Marcus dropped the paper back onto the mahogany table. The arrogant patriarch was dead. In exactly 1 month, they would be completely homeless. They had no money hidden away. They had no credit left to leverage. And as they stared at the locked glass door of the conference room, they finally realized that they had no golden son-in-law left to save them. The weight of the eviction notice finally shatters the last remnants of Tasha's denial. She looks from the locked glass door back to me. The realization that her luxury lifestyle has vaporized into thin air leaves her hyperventilating. She scrambles up from the cold marble floor, smoothing down the wrinkles in her expensive maternity dress. She wipes her tear-stained face and rapidly tries to recalibrate her manipulation strategy. If Brad cannot save her from federal investigators, and our parents are completely broke, I am the absolute only life raft left in the room. She approaches my end of the massive mahogany table. She does not use the aggressive and entitled tone she wielded at the restaurant just hours ago. She switches seamlessly to the trembling, desperate voice of a helpless victim. She tells me that her husband is going to federal prison and her bank accounts will definitely be frozen by the authorities. She places both trembling hands protectively over her pregnant stomach, leaning forward dramatically so I can see the heavy tears welling in her panicked eyes. She begs me to let her move into my downtown penthouse. She claims she just needs a safe, secure place for my future niece or nephew to be born. She promises she will stay out of my way, claiming we can finally be the close, loving sisters we were always meant to be. Tasha pushes harder, refusing to let the heavy silence deter her. She tells me that she knows I have a massive penthouse with multiple empty guest rooms. She cries that it would be unimaginably cruel and inhumane to leave a pregnant woman to fend for herself on the dangerous city streets, when I have more money than I could ever possibly spend in one lifetime. Vivian immediately jumps in to support this new angle, desperate to secure housing for her favorite child. My mother wipes her own eyes and tells me this is my divine chance to step up and be the bigger person. She commands me to take Tasha in, claiming that protecting the family bloodline is my absolute moral obligation. Vivian insists that Tasha's baby requires a wealthy, stable environment to thrive and that my penthouse is the only acceptable solution for their sudden emergency. They are teaming up against me again, seamlessly pivoting from treating me like a disposable peasant to treating me like their personal luxury hotel. They genuinely believe that throwing an innocent unborn child in my face will instantly erase a lifetime of calculated abuse and relentless financial sabotage. They think the mere mention of a baby is a magic key that will automatically unlock the vault to my private sanctuary. I look at my sister's desperate face and feel absolutely no inclination to open my doors. I keep my voice completely steady and ruthlessly clear. I ask Tasha why she thinks I would ever let the toxic chaos I spent a decade escaping cross the threshold of my home. I remind her that my penthouse is my personal safe haven paid for with money I earned through blood and sweat while she was busy mocking my community college degree and laughing at my empty bank account. I tell her that I refuse to let her infect my hard-earned peace with her relentless entitlement and her pathological need for drama. Tasha screams that I am a heartless monster punishing an innocent baby for the mistakes of its parents. I look right into her eyes and state that the real tragedy is not that her child might have to grow up in a modest, affordable apartment. The real tragedy is that she was perfectly willing to raise her child in a home funded entirely by stolen client money and forged signatures. I tell her she was ready to build a lavish nursery, using funds stolen from elderly retirees and the equity ripped violently from our parents' property. I explain that bringing a child into a life of criminal deceit just to maintain an artificial social media aesthetic is the ultimate form of child abuse. I tell Tasha she does not need a room in my penthouse. She needs a harsh dose of reality, a rigorous reality check, and a minimum wage job application to understand the true value of hard work. Vivian gasps in absolute horror, reaching out to aggressively console her weeping golden child. Marcus drops his head heavily into his hands, entirely defeated by the absolute collapse of his patriarchal authority. They have exhausted every single manipulation tactic in their extensive arsenal. They tried sheer intimidation. They tried throwing around empty corporate threats. They tried aggressively leveraging pathetic maternal guilt trips. They tried weaponizing an unborn baby to extract my resources. Every single strategy they deployed crashed and burned against the solid, impenetrable wall of my financial and emotional independence. I have systematically dismantled their leverage, and they are finally completely out of ammunition. I do not offer them a lengthy closing speech or a lingering moment of false sympathy. I simply push my heavy leather executive chair back. The wheels glide incredibly smoothly across the soft imported office rug. I stand up to my full height, towering over the pathetic ruins of their fragile egos. I calmly reach down and button the center button of my bespoke blazer, adjusting my sharp lapels with practiced, effortless precision. I reach across the table and sweep the Vanguard internal audit, the forged loan documents, and the eviction notice back into the heavy red legal folder. I carefully tap the edges of the thick folder against the polished mahogany table, squaring the papers away, with a sharp, definitive smack that echoes loudly through the sterile room. I look at them one last time, allowing the absolute finality of the moment to settle completely over them. The meeting is officially over. The silence in the glass room is absolutely deafening as my family finally realizes their manipulation tactics have absolutely zero power over me anymore. I turned my back on the massive mahogany table. My heels clicked against the polished marble floor with a steady, rhythmic finality. I was only 2 steps away from the heavy frosted glass doors when Vivian's voice cracked through the sterile air of the boardroom. She shrieked my name. Her voice was not commanding or authoritative anymore. It was the desperate, jagged sound of a woman who had just realized she was free-falling without a parachute. She cried out, asking how I could possibly do this. She screamed that I was going to leave my own mother with absolutely nothing. I stopped. I did not turn around immediately. I stood facing the frosted glass, taking a deep, steadying breath. I let her desperate question hang in the air, allowing the sheer hypocrisy of her words to settle over the room. I slowly turned my head and looked back at the 3 broken people huddled together in the center of my corporate empire. Vivian was clutching the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her face smeared with ruined makeup. Marcus stood completely paralyzed, staring at the foreclosure notice like it was a death sentence. Tasha was weeping silently, holding her stomach, realizing that her white savior husband was currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser, and her luxury lifestyle was officially dead. I looked directly into my mother's panicked eyes. I kept my voice incredibly calm, devoid of any anger or malice. I told her that she left me with absolutely nothing when I was 18 years old. I watched her flinch as I forced her to remember the exact night she and Marcus threw my belongings onto the front porch in the freezing rain. I reminded her how she explicitly told me that I was a financial burden and that Tasha deserved my college savings because Tasha knew how to attract wealthy men. I reminded her how she locked the front door while I stood on the porch with 2 black trash bags containing everything I owned in the world. I stepped back toward the table, ensuring my voice carried the heavy weight of undeniable truth. I told Vivian that when she threw me out, I did not have a venture capital firm. I did not have a team of corporate lawyers or a luxury penthouse. I had $32 in my checking account and a severely injured leg from a car accident. She used to buy Tasha a BMW. I told her that she handed me a life sentence of crushing poverty and expected me to quietly disappear so she could focus entirely on her golden child. I gestured around the multi-million-dollar boardroom. I told them that I took the absolute nothing they gave me, and I built an empire out of it. I explained that I learned how the financial markets operate because I was starving. I learned how predatory lending works because collection agencies harassed me daily while they were busy hosting lavish Sunday dinners. I told my mother that I did not just survive the nothingness she threw me into. I weaponized it. I turned my trauma into financial literacy and my rejection into unparalleled corporate power. Vivian shook her head wildly, tears streaming down her face. She sobbed that it was different back then. She pleaded that they were just trying to teach me tough love to make me strong. She claimed she always knew I was capable of greatness, and that her pushing me away was the catalyst for my massive success. The sheer delusion required to take credit for the empire I built after they abandoned me was staggering. I smiled a cold, sharp smile that offered absolutely zero comfort. I told her that if throwing a child out onto the street is the secret recipe for building character and massive wealth, then I am simply returning the favor. I told Vivian that I am giving her the exact same opportunity she gave me. I pointed at the eviction notice resting on the mahogany table. I told my parents and my sister that they have exactly 30 days to pack their belongings. I told them to take the nothing they have left and see what kind of empire they can build out of it. I suggested they use all the tough love and resilience they supposedly taught me to figure out how to survive in the real world without a stolen trust fund or a fraudulent son-in-law to pay their bills. Tasha let out a loud, agonizing wail. She begged me not to walk away, screaming that she was terrified and did not know how to be poor. She cried that Brad was going to prison and she had never worked a real job in her entire adult life. She pleaded for just a fraction of my wealth, just enough to keep her comfortable until the baby arrived. I looked at my sister, feeling a profound sense of closure. I told Tasha that her financial education was about to begin and she should probably start practicing how to fill out job applications instead of begging for unearned bailouts. I turned my back on them for the final time. I did not wait for Marcus to offer another empty patriarchal threat. I did not wait for Vivian to launch into another manipulative maternal guilt trip. I walked directly to heavy, frosted glass doors. I placed my hand on the sleek metal handle. The security guard standing in the hallway immediately stepped back, clearing my path to freedom. I stepped out of the conference room and pulled the heavy door shut behind me. The thick glass sealed perfectly into the frame. The heavy metallic click of the automatic locking mechanism echoed sharply in the quiet executive corridor. That single mechanical sound instantly severed me from their toxicity. The soundproof glass completely extinguished the noise of their frantic sobbing and desperate screaming. I stood in the quiet hallway watching them through the frosted pane like fish trapped in a sterile aquarium. They were gesturing wildly, trapped entirely in a cage built from their own greed, entitlement, and catastrophic financial illiteracy. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I did not feel the crushing weight of family obligation that had suffocated me for 3 decades. I felt a profound, soaring lightness in my chest. I smoothed the lapels of my bespoke blazer and took a deep breath of the crisp, air-conditioned office air. I turned away from the glass room, leaving them to drown in the consequences of their own actions. I walked down the marble hallway, my heels clicking with the steady, confident rhythm of a woman who had completely reclaimed her narrative. The war was officially over, and I was the only one left standing. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind me, and the sound of my heels against the imported Italian marble became the only rhythm that mattered. The air outside Conference Room A felt infinitely lighter. I walked down the main corridor of my venture capital firm, letting the adrenaline slowly drain from my system. This was not the chaotic, panicked adrenaline of my 20s when I was working 3 night shifts just to keep the heat on in a terrible studio apartment. This was the cold, calculated rush of total victory. I moved past the open concept workstations where my teams of financial analysts and junior partners were rapidly typing away at their multi-monitor setups. They parted like the Red Sea as I walked through the bullpen. Junior associates nodded respectfully, clutching their tablets. Senior partners offered tight, appreciative smiles, recognizing the absolute authority radiating from my posture. Nobody here saw me as a rebellious, ungrateful daughter or a bitter spinster. They saw a brilliant, ruthless strategist who had just engineered a multi-million-dollar acquisition and subsequently disposed of a corporate embezzler before lunch. I reached the end of the long corridor and bypassed my executive assistant, Sarah, who gave me a silent, validating nod. I pushed open the solid oak double doors to my private corner office. The space was massive, wrapped entirely in floor-to-ceiling glass that offered an unobstructed, breathtaking panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. I walked over to the windows, looking out over the sprawling city that had once tried to crush me. I remembered wandering these exact streets 14 years ago with nothing but 2 trash bags full of clothes and a severely injured leg, crying into a burner phone while my mother ignored my calls. Today I owned the buildings I used to clean. I stood there watching the tiny cars move along the gray pavement below and waited for the familiar wave of familial guilt to wash over me. Society conditions us to believe that cutting off your own blood will inherently leave a gaping, painful void in your chest. They tell you that no matter how toxic your parents are, you will always feel a deep, agonizing regret when you finally sever the cord. I waited for the regret, but it never came. There was absolutely zero guilt in my heart. Instead, I felt the profound euphoric lightness of a patient waking up from surgery after a skilled doctor successfully amputated a dead infected limb. The infection of my family's relentless entitlement, their covert racism wrapped in Brad's white savior complex, and their chronic financial illiteracy had been poisoning my peace of mind for decades. I had finally excised the rot. I had not just reclaimed my grandmother's brownstone or secured my financial assets. I had completely reclaimed my entire narrative. I was no longer the scapegoat they could blame for their own miserable choices. I was the architect of my own reality. I walked over to my custom mahogany desk and ran my fingers along the smooth, polished edge. I did not need to perform for anyone anymore. I did not need to shrink myself down to make Tasha feel superior or dim my intelligence to make Marcus feel like a powerful patriarch. I had won the only game that actually mattered. I sat down in my leather executive chair and let out a long, slow breath. The silence in my office was pristine, unbothered by the frantic begging of people who only remembered my name when they needed a bailout. I reached for the sleek glass carafe on my desk, pouring myself a small glass of ice-cold water. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the taste of absolute autonomy. I opened my laptop, ready to dive back into the quarterly earnings reports of my latest tech acquisition. The drama with my family was just a minor administrative hurdle that had been successfully cleared from my schedule. I was ready to get back to the business of expanding my empire. But before my fingers could even touch the keyboard, the private secure line on my desk phone began to flash. It was a direct line reserved only for my highest-level partners and emergency contacts. I placed my glass down and pressed the speaker button, leaning back in my chair. I answered with a crisp, professional greeting. The voice on the other end was smooth, polished, and immediately recognizable. It was Antoine, the general manager of the elite steakhouse, where this entire masterclass in self-destruction had begun just a few hours ago. He apologized for interrupting my afternoon, but stated that he had an urgent update regarding the unpaid balance of $10,450 from the private dining room. I smiled, leaning forward slightly. I told Antoine to go ahead and give me the final damage report. I asked him how my family handled the realization that they were completely trapped without a single working credit card among them. Antoine maintained his strict professional tone, but I could hear the faint trace of amusement hiding just beneath the surface of his words. He informed me that after a prolonged and highly aggressive argument with the restaurant's security team, Marcus and Vivian finally realized that the police were actually en route to arrest them for theft of services. Panicking, they frantically agreed to surrender their personal valuables as collateral to avoid being hauled out of the dining room in handcuffs in front of their horrified extended relatives. Antoine paused, taking a steadying breath before delivering the punchline. He explained that my mother had aggressively slapped her diamond earrings onto the host stand, loudly proclaiming they were flawless, 2-carat stones worth at least $20,000. Brad had arrogantly unbuckled his heavy gold Rolex, throwing it next to the earrings, while screaming that the timepiece alone could buy the entire restaurant. Antoine told me that he immediately had the restaurant's in-house jeweler verify the items for collateral intake. I listened carefully, waiting for the inevitable truth. Antoine cleared his throat and delivered the exact financial reality of my family's fabricated existence. He told me that he just received the official appraisal back from the jeweler. He stated that the heavy gold Rolex was a high-quality counterfeit purchased from a replica dealer, and my mother's flawless diamond earrings were actually cheap cubic zirconia set in plated brass. He paused, letting the absolute humiliation of the situation hang in the air. Antoine told me that the combined resale value of their fake luxury items barely covered $2,000. The restaurant was still short $8,000 on the Lobster bill. The ambient lighting inside the high-end wine bar in downtown Chicago was dim and soothing, a stark contrast to the harsh fluorescent lights of the corporate boardroom I had dominated just hours earlier. I sat at a private corner booth, swirling a glass of a rare, full-bodied vintage. The quiet hum of soft jazz in the background provided a peaceful rhythm to the evening, but my eyes were fixated on the muted television screen mounted above the bar. I did not need the audio to understand the spectacle unfolding on the screen. The financial news network had broken into its regular evening programming with an urgent breaking news bulletin. Red banners flashed across the bottom of the display, the bold white text scrolling relentlessly across the ticker. It read that a Vanguard senior portfolio manager had been arrested in connection with a multi-million-dollar embezzlement and wire fraud scheme. Then came the image that officially sealed the fate of my family's social aspirations. Brad's booking mugshot filled the screen. His slicked-back hair was completely disheveled, his eyes were bloodshot and wide with uncontainable panic, and the red mark on his nose from hitting my mahogany table was distinctly visible under the bright police station lights. The news anchor brought up a graphic detailing the fraudulent accounts, the forged loan documents, and the sheer scale of the financial deception he had maintained for years. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, watching the public execution of their fake prestige, the white finance bro my parents had worshipped, the man they had held up as the ultimate gold standard of success, while treating me like a failure, was now being paraded across national television as a common criminal. The narrative my mother had spun to her church friends and neighbors about her daughter marrying into Wall Street royalty was thoroughly and permanently shattered. Every single person in their social circle was watching that same news broadcast. The fake luxury, the counterfeit designer, bags, the arrogance, and the entitlement had all collapsed into an embarrassing public mugshot. My mind drifted back to the dozens of Sunday dinners where Brad had sat at the head of the table lecturing me about financial responsibility, while my parents nodded along in reverent awe. I remembered how my father would pass the best cuts of meat to Brad, laughing at his arrogant jokes while ignoring my presence entirely. They had sacrificed my accident settlement, my emotional well-being, and ultimately their own home to fuel a lie. They had chosen a fraud over their own daughter simply because he fit their desperate, shallow image of status. Now that very image was being dissected by financial analysts on live television. There was no sadness in my heart as I watched his mugshot fade into a commercial break. There was only a profound, crystalline clarity. The game was over, and the truth had won. I set my wineglass down on the polished dark wood table, feeling the absolute weightlessness of total liberation. My phone rested silently beside my glass, devoid of notifications, because I had permanently blocked every single one of their numbers before leaving the office. They could no longer reach me, guilt-trip me, or demand that I clean up their wreckage. I was completely unreachable to the people who had spent my life trying to drain me. A warm, reassuring hand gently touched my shoulder, breaking my gaze from the television. I looked up to see Marcus, my former university professor, and the seasoned investor who had taken a chance on me when I was 19, broke and limping with a shattered leg. Flanking him were Elena and David, my two co-founders and closest friends. They were the people who had stayed up with me in cheap diners during the early days of my startup, drinking lukewarm coffee and reviewing business models until 4 in the morning. They were the ones who had celebrated my victories covered for me when I was exhausted and built an empire alongside me without ever asking me to shrink who I was. Marcus offered a warm, knowing smile, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. He looked up at the television screen for a second, then looked back at me, his eyes filled with quiet pride. He told me that he had just seen the breaking news report on the drive over. He said he was not surprised in the slightest that the house of cards had finally fallen, adding that the market always eventually corrects itself when people trade integrity for illusions. Elena slid into the booth beside me, placing a supportive arm around my shoulders. She looked at me with deep affection and said that they had been worried about me all afternoon after hearing about the chaotic invasion in our corporate lobby. She asked if I was truly okay if the confrontation had left any lingering wounds. I looked around the table at the 3 people sitting with me. They were not connected to me by blood or DNA. They were not bound to me by ancestral obligations or legal contracts. They were connected to me by mutual respect, shared struggles, and an unshakable foundation of genuine love. They were the family I had carefully chosen and cultivated while escaping the toxic legacy of the family I had been born into. I smiled at Elena, feeling a deep, authentic warmth spread through my chest. I told her that I was better than okay. I told my chosen family that for the first time in 33 years, I was completely free. I picked up my wine glass, and my 3 closest allies immediately raised theirs in unison, their glasses clinking together softly in the quiet bar, signaling the end of my long war and the beginning of a life lived entirely on my own terms. The crisp sound of fine crystal ringing together in the dim, soothing lighting of the wine bar was the perfect antithesis to the harsh, jarring buzz of declined credit cards. I held my glass of vintage champagne against the soft glow of the table candle, letting the golden bubbles rise to the surface. I looked at Marcus, my former professor, who was calmly discussing market trends with David. I looked at Elena, who was leaning against the leather booth, radiating a fierce, unyielding loyalty. I looked at the 3 of them and realized the absolute stark contrast between the dinner that started this evening and the dinner that was ending it. Just hours ago, I was sitting at a massive private dining table surrounded by 16 people who shared my DNA. I watched them gorge themselves on Maine lobster and Wagyu beef, treating me like an invisible ATM. They ordered $1,000 bottles of cognac to soothe their deep insecurities. They weaponized their appetites to establish dominance. They consumed and consumed and consumed, projecting a hollow illusion of wealth while secretly drowning in fraudulent debt. They demanded my money to fix their mistakes. They demanded my inheritance to save their house. They demanded my complete submission simply because we happened to share a bloodline. Here in this quiet corner booth, there were no demands. There were no hidden agendas lurking beneath the polite conversation. I did not have to earn my seat at this table. I did not have to fund a lavish banquet to be acknowledged. I did not have to shrink my intelligence to make anyone feel powerful. When the waiter brought over an artisan charcuterie board and a second bottle of our chosen vintage, David smoothly handed over his sleek metal card. He did not make a grand, theatrical show of it. He did not tap his watch or loudly announce his credit limit to the room like Brad had done. David simply paid the bill because we take turns taking care of each other. There was no tally being kept. There was no emotional blackmail attached to the transaction. There was only mutual respect. There was only genuine love. I took a slow sip of the champagne, letting the crisp, cold liquid ground me in the present moment. For 33 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of my family's expectations. I carried the weight of my mother's constant belittlement. I carried the weight of my father's aggressive patriarchal demands. I carried the weight of my sister's relentless, cruel jealousy. I had spent my entire life believing that true wealth was a number in a bank account. I believed that if I just acquired enough capital, if I just built a big enough empire, I could finally buy my way out of their abuse. I thought the millions in my venture capital fund were my ultimate shield. But sitting here surrounded by my chosen family, I realized the profound truth about real wealth. True wealth is not the balance sheet of my investment firm. True wealth is not the historic brownstone I flipped or the luxury penthouse I return to every night. True wealth is the absolute undeniable peace of mind I felt right in this very second. True wealth is knowing that I am fundamentally, permanently untouchable. My assets are untouchable. My career is untouchable. My peace is untouchable. My mind drifted one last time to the people I had left behind in that soundproof glass boardroom. I pictured Brad sitting in a cold concrete holding cell, stripped of his tailored suits and his fake progressive ally persona, finally facing the brutal reality of his federal crimes. I pictured Tasha standing in the center of her expensive penthouse, looking at the designer bags she bought with stolen money, realizing that her entire identity was about to be repossessed by the government. I pictured Vivian and Marcus driving back to the sprawling suburban house they had stolen from me, staring at the eviction notice sitting on their dashboard. They chose the illusion, they chose the fraud, they chose the aesthetic over the authentic, and now they had exactly 30 days to pack up the illusions they had prioritized over their own daughter. They had 30 days to realize that the safety net they thought they could aggressively command into existence had been entirely dismantled by the very person they threw out on the street. I felt no lingering trauma. The deep, aching wounds they had inflicted on me when I was a teenager were completely healed, leaving behind nothing but smooth, impenetrable scar tissue. There were no loose strings left to tie. There were no secret bank accounts they could drain, no emotional levers they could pull, no societal guilt trips they could leverage. I had systematically, legally, and publicly severed every single mechanism they used to control me. Tomorrow morning, my property management team would officially file the repossession paperwork with the county clerk. Tomorrow morning, the house they used as a fortress of fake prestige would officially belong to my firm's distressed asset portfolio. Tomorrow morning, they would wake up to a world where they had absolutely zero power over Jada. Elena noticed my quiet reflection and bumped her shoulder gently against mine. She smiled a bright, authentic smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She did not ask me if I was sad because she knew I was not. She simply raised her glass again, silently offering a toast to the future. I raised my vintage champagne to meet hers. Marcus and David immediately joined in bringing their glasses to the center of the table. I looked at the people who had helped me build my empire. I looked at the family I had chosen. I looked at the beautiful, peaceful life I had constructed from the absolute nothingness my parents had handed me. I smiled a genuine, relaxed smile, taking a final, satisfying sip of the champagne. I knew that the ultimate revenge was never about the money, or the corporate maneuvers, or the dramatic confrontations. The ultimate sweet revenge is simply a life beautifully lived, entirely and unapologetically on my own terms. I was finally completely undeniably free. The most powerful lesson from Jada's journey is that true wealth is not just financial capital, it is the ultimate freedom of untouchable peace. When toxic family members view you as a disposable resource, your greatest revenge is silent, relentless success. You cannot heal in the very environment that broke you, nor should you sacrifice your hard-earned stability to rescue those who deliberately engineered your downfall. Blood ties do not excuse abuse, and biological connections are never a substitute for genuine respect. By setting ironclad boundaries, you completely reclaim your entire narrative. Please subscribe today for more empowering revenge stories.